Today's destination is the city of 100 spies, the Czech capital, Prague. Since the Velvet Revolution of 1989, visitors from many lands have been discovering Prague as one of the jewels in the crown of Central Europe, one that had been concealed for 40 years by the gloomy cover of communism. Not only Prague, but an entire country has re-emerged to reveal its hitherto hidden glories of rich history, deep culture, art, music, and wonderful natural attractions. For the Czech Republic is a land of striking historical figures, strong legends, and romantic fairy tales, which are illustrated nicely by the country having more than 2,000 castles, plus the natural wonders, and the magnificent architecture from so many different eras. These are the Czech lands. So let's take a peek into history to find out more.
Can you imagine the number of people who have passed this way over the centuries? Whether they were trudging through the snow or walking through a green forest here in Central Europe, they were part of a cavalcade of people who lived out their lives here in what now has become, as we read, an incredible part of human history.
One such group was the Slavs. It's believed they originated somewhere north of the Great Pripyat Marshes in present-day Belarus. The move westwards by Western Slavs led to the emergence of several different groupings which we now know as the Polish, Czech, Moravian, Slovak and Sorb peoples.
The story of the Slavs was a subject which fascinated the great Czech Art Nouveau artist Alfons Mucha, who after his successful career in Paris returned home and began work on his project of 20 paintings called the Slav Epic, tracing the roots of his own race. His themes were also used in Obecny Dom, or municipal house, as well as one of the colourful windows in Prague's Grand St. Vitus Cathedral. While his Slav epic, after being displayed in the US, was given by Mucha to the city of Prague in 1920 and was eventually displayed in his home district at Moravsky Krumlov in South Moravia. Many children here have learned the story of the Western Slavs from a Czech puppet film. The film illustrated the story of three tribal leaders, Czech, Lech and Rus, and their groups arriving at the mound called Žip in Bohemia. There are many variations to this legend, but it's claimed that while Czech settled his tribe in what became the Czech lands, thereby named Czechy, or Bohemia, after the original boy Celtic settlers who were driven away by the Germans in the 1st century, Czech's brother Lech travelled further northeast and settled in Poland after finding a white eagle building its nest there. The third brother, Rus, went south to settle his group in what became Ruthenia, in the Ukraine area. So it's thought that these three brothers founded three Slavic nations sometime between the 2nd and the 4th centuries. During the 7th century, Moravia was dominated by a Frankish merchant called Samo, who formed his own empire and whose descendants created the Great Moravian Empire in Samo's Moravian territories and extended them into present-day Slovakia. From around the 8th century comes the legend of Princess Libusha, one of the three daughters of the legendary ruler Krok. She became widely known for her wisdom and a prophecy that she made from their ancient castle at Vyšehrad, meaning higher castle, when she pointed to another high point and proclaimed that a city would arise there which, quote, one day will touch the stars, unquote. This prophecy is thought to have been fulfilled by Prague becoming known as the city of 100 spires. Libusha had told them to commence building the city on a site where they would find a man who was working on a threshold to his house. Hence the new city was named Praha, the old Czech word meaning threshold. But when Libusha eventually became a tribal chieftain herself, some males objected to being ruled by a woman and urged her to marry a male prince. Instead, she found a common ploughman called Przemysl. Together they began the Przemyslid dynasty, which lasted through thick and thin until the 14th century. By the end of the 9th century, Przemysl ruler Prince Bolshevoy and his wife Ludmila had been baptized by Methodius, who along with another Greek evangelist, Cyril, brought Christianity to the pagan Bohemians. Worth mentioning at this point is Bolshevoy's grandson, who became the patron saint of the Czechs. He was the early 10th century Archduke Václav, also known as Wenceslaus, and more commonly in English as Wenceslas, due to the English Christmas carol Good King Wenceslas. He certainly became heir to the Bohemian throne at the age of 13, and was very popular, but he was never crowned a king. He was brought up by his Christian grandmother Ludmila at what is known as the Queen's Castle at Milnik, high above the meeting point of the Labe or Elbe and Vltava rivers. Václav's German-born mother Drahomira, after her husband's death, was unhappy about having to share power with Václav's grandmother Ludmila, a Christian. She successfully plotted to have her murdered. Ludmila's tomb is inside the St. George Basilica in the Prague castle complex. However, Drahomira's other son, Boleslav, also had political ambitions, and after he had invited his older brother, the revered Václav, to his castle and a town later named after him as Stary Boleslavi, he had Václav murdered by 3 companions on the way to church. Following a public outcry, Boleslav, later dubbed Boleslav the Cruel, repented the murder and brought his brother's remains back to Prague, where they lie in a chapel encrusted with 14th century gemstones inside St. Vitus Cathedral. The feast day of St. Wenceslas on September 28 is observed as a public holiday throughout the Czech Republic. The 14th century saw the ushering in of the Golden Age of Prague. At the end of the Přemyslid dynasty, with the death of Václav III in 1306, through the female side the title to Bohemia passed from the Přemyslids to the Luxembourgs, and later to the houses of Polish Jagiello and Austrian Habsburg, the later leading to Habsburg occupation and national repression. But back to the 14th century. John of Luxembourg was a career soldier and was not often at home in his realm, but his son Karol, or Charles, was to become one of Bohemia's most respected monarchs after he took control in 1346, and soon afterwards was elected Holy Roman Emperor. Reigning as Charles IV, he had powerful friends. Having been brought up in the French court, he brought French and German architects to rebuild Prague as a city reflecting its importance at the centre of the trade routes of the Middle Ages. He also brought French grapevines into the Czech lands. He built the first stone bridge, the Charles Bridge, across the Vltava River, which stands as a landmark of Prague today, and he founded Central Europe's first university, the Charles University, in 1348. His lavish building program was funded by the rich silver deposits at nearby Kutná Hora, southeast of Prague. But by the end of the 14th century, Prague's golden age was over. Charles's son, Václav IV, was on the throne, ruling over a troubled nation. In the summer of 1380, a plague broke out in Bohemia. In 1389, 3,000 Jews were locked into the Prague synagogue and murdered, even though there had been a strong Jewish community since the 10th century in Prague. The catalyst for this tragedy came as a priest was hit with a few grains of sand by small Jewish boys playing in the street. He became insulted and insisted that the Jewish community had plotted against him. Thousands were then slaughtered. The synagogue and the cemetery were destroyed and homes were pillaged. The king, Václav IV, widely regarded as an ineffectual leader at best and a drunken ruler at worst, insisted that the responsibility rested with the Jews for venturing outside during Holy Week. But Václav IV was soon to face both a revolt by the Bohemian nobles and further serious religious unrest. At the end of the 14th century, the life of a priest called John of Nepomuk came to a tragic end. John, who came from the town Nepomuk, got involved in a power dispute with the Prague Archbishop, John of Jenstein, and the king, Václav IV. Today it still isn't clear exactly why Václav IV had John of Nepomuk killed. As John was the Queen's confessor, a legend has grown up that the priest had refused to divulge the contents of Queen Zofie's confession. Whatever the real reason, Václav IV had John of Nepomuk tortured and then thrown off the Charles Bridge, where he drowned in the Vltava River in the year 1393. It's said that a circle of stars appeared above the spot where he drowned. During the 17th century, his statue was added to the Charles Bridge and on other bridges through Central Europe, with stars depicted above his head, as John of Nepomuk became a popular Catholic icon as a counter-Reformation saint, with tourists now stopping to touch the base of his statue for luck. A shrine to the saint was also added to the St. Vitus Cathedral. At about the same time as the king's problems with John of Nepomuk, other religious stirrings were rising from the pulpit of the newly built Bethlehem Chapel in Prague and within Charles University. A preacher called Jan Hus, born at Husinec, southwest of Prague, had been greatly influenced by the writings of English theologian John Wycliffe, and he began conducting his sermons in Czech rather than in Latin, so that the common man could understand them. He also advocated the giving of communion in both kinds, that is, bread and wine, representing the body and blood of Christ, in the sacrament of Holy Communion. Hus was not seeking to form a new church, but he was critical of the Roman Church for its excessive policies of amassing wealth, selling indulgences, and allowing the rich to buy their way out of even mortal sins. Even as these ideas were gaining popularity in the Czech lands, they were becoming very unpopular in other areas of the Holy Roman Empire, especially the Vatican. At first, the Bohemian king Václav IV hesitated to side with the Catholic Church and condemn Hus. This assumed support for Hus led to an increase in the calls for church reform, and among other criticisms of Václav IV, led to him being temporarily deposed and imprisoned. Eventually, his younger brother Sigismund became a major player in European politics. Sigismund had already been involved in several political intrigues, including crowning himself as King of Hungary, and then through further intrigues becoming King of the Germans, and much later Holy Roman Emperor. But he was to play a major role when in 1414 the Church summons Jan Hus to explain his proposed reforms to the Council of Constance in Switzerland. Sigismund promised him safe conduct, guaranteeing his safety for the duration of his journey. But as a secular ruler, Sigismund would not have been able to make any guarantees for the safety of Hus in a papal court, a fact that Hus should have been aware of. However, it is possible that Hus was thinking that a guarantee of safe conduct was also a sign of patronage by the king, and that therefore he could rely on royal support during the proceedings. This did not happen. And on November 3, 1414, Hus arrived to find posters already stating that he was a heretic. Within a month he was imprisoned and eventually tried in June of the following year. However, rather than a trial, the evidence points to the sessions being simply demands that a heretic recant all his writings. He refused, and this led to the burning of Master Jan Hus at the stake on July 6, 1415. Just prior to his execution, he uttered the words, "God is my witness that I have never taught that of which I have by false witnesses been accused. In the truth of the gospel which I have written, taught, and preached, I will die today with gladness." Also allegedly among his final words were these, "In 100 years, God will raise up a man whose calls for reform cannot be suppressed." In fact, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses of contention to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany, 102 years later. The advantage Luther had over Hus with his proposed reforms a century later was that the printing press had been invented, and his proposals had been spread throughout Europe and read by thousands. But the brutal killing of Jan Hus only served to incense and unite his followers, who came to be known as the Hussites. The situation culminated in 1419 with what is called the First Defenestration of Prague, in which Hussites threw 7 members of the Czech town council out of Prague's new town hall window, and to their deaths on the points of Hussite-wielded pikes below. The Hussites, led by the one-eyed military leader Jan Žižka, defeated 5 waves of the Catholic Crusaders, who were pitched in a battle against them. It's said that many of the Crusaders were terrified at hearing the Hussite battle song, "Ye Warriors of God." Their symbol was the chalice, and their motto, "Truth Prevails." This motto was later used by the first president of Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Masaryk, as well as by the man who was to become the first president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, during the Velvet Revolution against communist rule. However, from the very start, the Hussite movement had been divided into factions. The most prominent division was along economic lines. A number of peasant Hussites were considered nothing more than hooligans, or even terrorists, who joined the cause only so that they could have a good excuse to go around robbing churches and setting them aflame with Catholics inside. These practices were outlawed by the aristocratic Hussites. Over time, the movement splintered even more, even spawning an early nudist sect, the Adamites. Historians usually divide the Hussites into radical Taborites, named for the town of Tabor, a city the Hussites founded for the occasion of the Second Coming, which many considered imminent, and the moderate Utraquists, derived from their belief that communion should be given in both kinds. These were made up mostly of the nobility. This infighting came to a head in 1434 when the Czech Hussite factions fought among themselves. In 1436 the Church permitted the Utraquist Hussites to take communion in both kinds, to have their church services conducted in the Czech language, and absolved them of having to pay dues to Rome. The extremist Taborite Hussites were not a party to this agreement and refused to accept it. While the moderates stayed in the Catholic Church, the extremists went underground, forming their own church, ordaining their own bishops, pioneering public education, and sending out missionaries. The Hussites were defeated by their own division during this time, when a temporary diplomatic agreement was reached to end the fighting. But in the early 16th century, when the Habsburgs acquired Bohemia through their policy of making marriage instead of making war, the suppression of the national Slav identity by fearful Habsburg rulers began. This eventually led to a heated debate inside Prague Castle in 1618, and the second defenestration, when Habsburg councillors were thrown from a window, but were saved from death by landing on a dung heap below the windows. This incident sparked the European 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics, leading to the final Hussite defeat in the Czech lands in the 1621 Battle of White Mountain, followed by the execution of